Zoo Boys, Chapter 2, Part 8. Raft of Wrath. The raft the boys were using began to take on water as it lost air just 30 feet from the island. The boys weren't frustrated by this. They actually laughed, although Jeremy was blamed because it was his raft. At their age, between 11 and 14, it was a little easier to laugh at situations that would make a fully matured grown-up drop tears in their beer. The adolescents looked at this grim circumstance as just part of the exploration. The next comic they write would feature how they survived the mile-long trip in nothing but a cheap little raft. They'd be sure to illustrate how David carried the others onto the shore, just like soldiers storming the beach of Normandy. Ron often wrote things in the recesses of his mind. As life around him was taking place, he was making mental notes on how to capture what those moments were like in written word. As things unfolded, he was capsulating them in his head. Later, he would exaggerate or imaginate it into things larger than life. The trip would be written as miles long, even though it was only 200 or 300 yards away from the other shore. He knew 1 mile was much further than just 100 yards. There was no way the island was even close to 1 mile away, or 1,760 yards. As Ron wrote, John would draw. He too would accentuate the island as just a few dots out in the middle of the ocean. His illustrations of the raft would show at first how great it was, full of air, and then show its weak, flimsy, torn, tattered mess of inability while portraying the boy's strength, fearlessness, and triumphal physique. Northport, Florida, was an island, but the boys made it was not an island. We're going to have to change the name Northport, by the way, probably. Editorial note, sorry. Northport, Florida, was not an island, but the boys made it to Venice Beach, Florida, just one town over. From Venice, you could see Zoo Island. John's house was actually right on the line of where Northport touched Venice. Venice Beach itself was an inhabited island, but John's family lived one bridge away from that part of Venice. The other 3 boys told their parents John's family owned a campground on Venice Beach, and they'd be camping out there. The truth was, John's family lived near a relatively small patch of woods near the island that was part of Venice. The original plan was to set up a tent, but then leave it so they could make their way to Zoo Island. Spend the rest of the night there on Zoo Island, explore the next day, and return to the woods near Venice Beach the very next day before anyone would even notice they were gone. To add an extra cushion to their scheme, they said that if the first night went well, they'd stay a second night and be back home sometime Sunday morning. Jeremy campaigned that John's sister come along with them, but the raft was barely large enough for the 4 boys. Not only that, but the other 3 said, "No girls." Their real interest in girls, wouldn't start for another year or 2, but Jeremy really liked this particular girl. He liked her almost more than his other 2 friends, and definitely more than John. The only thing he didn't like about her was her name, Karen. Yuck. He thought, why was her name the same as his sister's name? Soaking wet, the boys crawled up onto the shore of Zoo Island. It was quiet. other than the strange, unusual sounds of a few animals hidden in the dark line of the woods. They were pretty sure the sporadic noises were just a few exotic birds. John spoke first. "Wow! Would you just listen to that?" he exclaimed with excitement, hiding his fear. The sounds of traffic, kids at play, and the adults barking at their children was replaced by what was the closest thing to the sound of silence the boys had ever experienced before. It was quiet enough for them to notice the waves lapping on the shore. The occasional night creature sound was amplified because the volume of everything else was hushed out there on the island. David puffed up and gave himself a punch to his inflated chest as he proclaimed, "Let's do this, dog!" He extended a hearty slap to Jeremy's back, threw a punch to Ronnie's arm, and engaged in a full-on headbutt toward John. That was the only way he knew to truly express his affection. John was able to dodge the affliction Dave tried to bring to his head. There was still contact, but it resulted in Dave's head only making impact with John's shoulder. Dave ordered loud and proud. Ron stood there frozen, looking at the bushes, only about 20 yards from the beach. Jeremy whispered, Dave, we might want to keep our voices down." John was pulling what was left of the raft fully onto the island sand. He heard the other boys, but was oblivious to whatever was brushing the bushes. Dave turned to address Jeremy. "You puh!" Before he could finish his mockery, the sound of rustling shrubs got louder. Ron was still standing dead in his tracks. Jeremy was not yet paralyzed by petrifying fear, but his terrification levels were rising. The boys' clothes were heavy and dripping wet. Dave gave the order in a less than haughty cry, "Hush!" although no one else was speaking but him. The three of them stood there with their mouths wide open and their eyes as big as flying saucers, while John was still preoccupied with trying to salvage their supplies from the raft. He was still completely unaware of the commotion on that side of the ocean. Ron shuddered softly. "I think there is some—" Dave spun, just his head quickly toward Ron. No words were needed. Ron shut up. Jeremy glanced at David to see how he was reacting in hopes that he'd find it within himself to copy the actions of his brave, heroic leader. Dave stood still, legs in a wide stance, one leg slightly forward and bending at the knee, the other leg slightly back, not extended, not bent at all. Jeremy noted David's arms were by his side, fists clenched, elbows bowed back. Jeremy put himself in a similar stance and tried to get into what he called a Dave state of mind. He wanted to be on the same page regardless of what may be on the rampage coming toward them. Dave's body was poised in the position. Come hell or high water, he was destined to win. He displayed not even one sliver of fear. He had no doubt, no question. He was fully ready, as if he had been training for this Olympic moment his entire lifetime. He was ready to cash in the payment earned from hours he put in with his cheap weightlifting bench in his garage. The wages he accumulated were about to be spent on this specific confrontation. They knew well enough to verify he'd spend it all if need be. Ron also looked at Dave as a role model, but he knew within himself that he was spineless. When it came to dealing with any kind of confrontation, Ronnie used his small portion of strength to run. The bushes and a few small trees were forced down and whatever it was large enough to clear its own path. Then the three boys got just a glimpse as the moonlight was glistening off the top of the head of this creature creeping toward them. Ron slipped out a few soft, meager words, of which only one made sense. "It's a gah!" David commanded Ron to shut up by waving his arm at him, not wanting to take his eyes off what was emerging out of the thicket. Jeremy was gradually freaking out, his body filled with adrenaline. His whole Dave's state of mind theory was swept away with the wind. His fight or flight instinct had no fight instinct in it. He yelled, "Run!" as he bolted down the beach with Ron following suit. David's first instinct was the opposite of his friend's. He always leaned more toward fighting than running away. In the gospel, according to Dave, running away was a sign of stupidity, moral softness, and overall weakness. His two closest friends depended on him, and he knew it. That dependence just made his will all the more stronger. Dave, with his head fully elevated, chin still up, eyes fixed on the threat, one arm slowly reaching down and grabbing one of the oars from their raft, he shouted as loud as he could toward the mysterious creature, "Come on! Bring it! Bring it on!" He stood armed and strong with the monster's response with a quick attack barreling toward him as with all its fearsome might. John finally looked up from his task, only to see the large head of a Komodo dragon coming in his direction. When offered with the split-second choice of fight or flight, Johnny's whole system instinctively decided to flee up the shoreline, not realizing he was heading in the opposite direction in which Ron and Jeremy fled. David was left there, the only one to combat this threatening monstrosity, regardless of which direction his teammates flew. But the land dragon decided to run after Johnny. Unlike the case with David and Goliath, this foe forfeited by turning away from Dave and from what Dave was about to throw down. It fell into a full-on chase after Johnny. With its turn, Dave noticed that only the head was a Komodo dragon. Its body was that of something else. Dave yelled, "Kia! Whoop! There it is! Who let the oomph?" With a hard thud, Dave bit the shore. His eager, overexcited adolescent body tripped him up as he went to run in the sand. He quickly got to his feet and went into a full pursuit mode, as if nothing had happened at all. He raced down the waterline while slinging the oar around his head like a ninja's staff. With the same velocity and speed of a domestic household pet, the thing was galloping over the footprints Johnny left behind. Dave briefly looked back in the direction Ron and Jeremy took. They were long gone. He then shifted his attention back to his front, just watching this mutated hybrid gain ground on Johnny. Johnny's legs burned, his ankles bent in the soft sand, and his lungs gasped for air during his feeble attempts to not be captured. He let out a yelp as his knees buckled, collapsing him to the ground. The legs of the pursuing beast propelled the shiny head toward its prey. David was close behind, still wanting to fight this thing. Johnny's screams turned from "Help! Help!" to "No! Stop! Stop! Don't stop, you silly..." As Dave approached, thinking the monster was eating his friend, he rose the oar and swung it full force, slapping the offender on its fart cannon. John began to laugh. Dave still was not fully realizing what was taking place. He heard John shouting with laughters mixed in, "Down, boy! Down! Down!" Then Johnny told Dave, "He's licking me like my dog does!" With the oar still raised in the air, David stood and watched as the long dragon tongue lapped John's face and its dog body and tail wagged with excitement. John composed himself and spoke directly to the strange animal. "What are you, huh, boy? What are you?" "That's a good boy. Good boy." Dave dropped to his knees as the freakish fellow turned toward him for some lovin'. Johnny expressed, "See? Just like a dog." David melted like a little boy seeing puppies for the first time as this thing shot out its wet, long, forked tongue toward his face. It was only then that John got to actually see the body. He spoke in unbelief. "It's a drog, a doggin', He searched his mind for a word that would accurately describe this mix between a dog and a dragon. Dave couldn't contain the mixture of joy along with a dose of disgust brought on by the typical behavior of a pet dog. He liked the tickle that made, oh my goodness, he liked the tickle that came from the unusual texture of, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I wish I could read. He liked the tickle that came from the unusual, weird texture of a tongue on his skin, but at the same time, comprehending how gross it is to be licked, especially when one thinks of where else that tongue has been. Surely this thing licked itself too, just like a family dog tends to do from time to time. John stood to his feet, sounding his concern. "Wait! The saliva of a Komodo dragon is poison!" Dave pushed the ever-eager animal off and got to his feet. "I feel fine. How about you?" he asked John. Johnny's mind was racing with fear of how they might both be infected. His real fear was of dying. Dave's fear was not about death, but the fear of missing out on the adventure. He proposed, "Oh, this won't keep us from exploring the island, will it?" John answered, "If we die, then yes. Yes, Dave, it will prevent us from living, let alone exploring." Dave patted the specimen's lizard head and pet the creature's dog body as he spoke directly to what he considered their newfound pet. "He's a good boy. Yes, he is. He is a good boy. You are a good boy. Yes, you are. We ain't gonna miss out." Then he included Johnny. "What should we name him?" John couldn't believe Dave's carefree oblivion, and yet, just as before, his mind once again searched for the name of the species that could also be a friendly name for a domestic reptile/mammal. His above grade point average teen brain flipped through pages of things that he had read and things that he drew before. He quickly skipped over a fictional character, the main protagonist from the novel The Hunchback of Notre Dame. If he recalled correctly, that person was born with what the average person would call defects. Still human, but different, unlike the others. His physical appearance was made up of undeniably abnormalities. John had a crystal clear picture in his head. He saw the feature. He saw the figure, back hunched over like a camel, forehead hanging low over one eye, and lips that were permanently crooked. He looked like someone hit him across the face with a boat paddle. That person was actually a very gentle, but the townfolk judged him by his looks alone. Their judgmental state of mind would not allow them to see him as a human being at all. He was shunned, feared, and hunted by others, as if he was some type of terrifying monster. But even he found sanctuary, care. He even found love. John's avalanche of thoughts were interrupted, temporarily barricaded, with Dave's suggestion. How about Dragon Dog or Komodo Dog? Then Johnny spurted out, Quasimodo! It sounded good. Dave agreed. Yeah, we'll call you, what is it again, Johnny? Automoto? John realized Dave had no idea where the name came from, as he confirmed Quasimodo. Dave spoke again, directly to his newfound friend. We'll call you Quasi, like Ozzy Osbourne. You're a bat out of hell, yes you are. Diary of a Madman. Crazy training mother effer. John wanted to give the background behind the name Quasimodo, but he didn't want to risk making Dave feel stupid or uneducated. He knew if he did say it out loud, it would only make him feel like a rejected nerd who was bullied for being too smart. When you're an awkward adolescent, trying to figure out what life is all about, all of the kids going through similar things, always finding something wrong or just different about you that they inevitably and relentlessly poke at. You're too smart, you're too dumb, you're too clean, you're too dirty, dressed too nice, can't afford name brand clothes. The list goes on and on. It seemed as if nothing was considered acceptable, all right, or just fine the way it is. Johnny knew all the stereotypes. He lived daily with the struggle of trying to be seen as pleasing. He would even settle for being remotely kind, or remotely nice, or remotely liked. The connotations associated with the nickname Quasi fit the animal and John pretty well. He was constantly seeking acceptance from his peers, and yet, right here, right now, before his very own eyes, one of the boys labeled a cool kid accepted this mixed up anything but normal animal. He embraced the differences. Dave scratched where the lizard skin stopped and the fur began. Or was it where the hair stopped and the scales started? John reached out to scratch just above the dog's tail, then, with his other hand, gently touched the lizard head. He said quietly, I really hope this thing doesn't kill us. As Dave replied, John realized he spoke out loud. Lost my place. As Dave replied, John realized he actually spoke out loud things that he was hiding in the crevices of his mind. He heard Dave say, Oh, come on! Quasi ain't no killer, are you, boy? The pet sat on its hind quarters, just like a everyday run-of-the-mill dog, and yet stretched out its scale Komodo dragon neck and head. Woohoo! We got a weird one here. Just look at this freakish thing. Hey, we gotta go get the cameras from the backpack, Dave exclaimed. John asked, Where's Jeremiah and Ronald? Jeremiah? Ronald? No one but their mom calls them that, Dave scolded him. But his fixation was on the new-found beast. John insisted on an answer. Where is Ron and Jeremy? While David pointed over his shoulder with one arm and patted Quasi in the chest area with his other hand, he exclaimed, They both pushed out like the pups they are. Johnny looked beyond Quasi and David, but saw no sign of the other boys. His own nerves of fear began to show. We could maybe follow the footprints, in the sand. Dave stood up straight. Quasi remained seated with his tongue hanging out of his mouth. His head matched up even with the height of David's hip. "Johnny boy, don't worry about them. You got me around and Quasi. What more do you need? Besides, it's a fairly small island. We'll find them, and we'll all meet up again." Johnny wasn't so much worried about the other two boys. He just felt safer in numbers. He also, under the persuasion that if he outran them from any danger chasing them, that they would be licked to death or whatever, rather than him being the next victim. "Hey!" Dave's voice jumped in, derailing John's thoughts once again. "We got this. I got this. Look, I'm the only one that came after you and to see if you were okay. I'm the one who saved you when you needed saving. Now come on. We'll find them too, together." Dave began to walk back to where the raft met the beach, patting his side, encouraging Quasi to follow him. He couldn't wait to tell Ron how he came up with the name. Johnny followed both of them, and Johnny couldn't wait to tell Ronald how he came up with the name of this radical, prehistoric-looking pet. Ron, a writer and pretty prolific reader, was the only one in the group that would comprehend and appreciate the background info. For the full name, Quasimodo, Dave commanded, "Come on, Quasi!" John flinched a little hearing Dave shorten the name. However, it was kind of a cooler name, a good nickname. The more Johnny processed it, the more he began to accept it. He thought to himself, yeah, at least it's just a shortening of the full name, Quasimodo. Then Dave said, "Maybe we should call him Ozzy." The uptight, rigid young scholar part of Johnny spoke up. "Nah, the name's been used. I like your idea of calling him Quasi, short for Quasimodo." John hoped his persuasion would stick. Dave knew he wasn't really the one to come up with the name, but thought it was great that Johnny gave him the credit anyway. Dave asked, "What's it short for again?" Glad for the opportunity, John began to explain once again. "It's actually short for a fictional character, the main protagonist of the novel The Hunchback of Notre Dame, by Victor Hugo. The creature, well, he wasn't really a creature, he was a man, but was born with a hunchback, and he was feared by the townspeople as sort of a monster. But he finds sanctuary in an unlikely love that is fulfilled." Dave's words lunged in, pushing Johnny's words to the early death. "Oh, I'm not asking you what's the name. I don't need a whole historic lesson. I'm not dumb. I know all that part that you're saying. I'm just saying, what's the longer name?" John still desired to give a short explanation, but thought it better to just give the response that Dave wanted to hear. Dave blurted out, "Oh, never mind. You're a hunchback of note or damn. Come on, Quasi and Johnny." They were finally really beginning to make some progress on their way back toward where they landed. Dave thought, did I really run this far? John couldn't get a word in edgewise, but he was glad Dave still wanted him around. The feeling of acceptance outweighed the need to be informed or informative to others. Dave said, "Johnny, I think I'll call you Jay for genius from now on." Johnny fought the urge to correct Dave's error. He just boarded up the thoughts in his own head, bit his tongue, kept hiding any sign of his own eagerness to chastise his friend's ignorance. He even asked himself, Does Dave really think the word genius actually starts with the letter J? Or, I don't know. He looked at Dave to see if he was just kidding around. He expected Dave to look over his shoulder and grin at him. There wasn't any indication of a prank. That helped John overcome the need to turn into a spelling bee or a grammar cop. Was the thought that Dave was now considering him a close enough friend to give him a nickname. At the same time, he smiled at just the thought of calling David D for dumb. Much like this creature, they found, or more clearly, that found them, it was more dog than dino or dragon. John noted the similarities. David was more brawny than brains, more jock than genius, and more smart-ass than just plain smart. That ends Zoo Boys Chapter 2. And there are no other parts. I hope that this isn't too long to upload. And now on to Chapter 3.